Today we're going to look at the Huberman Lab podcast, episode 12, How to Increase Motivation and Drive. The key ideas discussed in this episode are: Number 1, background on motivation. Number 2, dopamine. Number 3, pleasure-pain balance and addiction. Number 4, dopamine versus here and now molecules. Number 5, procrastination and motivation. Number 6, dopamine crash. Number 7, reward prediction error. Number 8, attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in kids. Number 9, dopamine schedule. And number 10, to maintain pursuit of goals. Idea number 1, background on motivation. Motivation and the chemistry of motivation are fundamental to our life. Without motivation, we wouldn't move. Motivation is about balancing pleasure and pain. There is a relationship between dopamine released in the brain and the desire to exert effort. Dopamine is responsible for our sense of motivation and movement. Dopamine is a double-edged sword, responsible for motivation and pleasure, but underlies addiction. Idea number 2, dopamine. Novelty is the number one trigger of dopamine release. Dopamine is the substrate from which adrenaline is made, or epinephrine in the brain, which allows us to take action. The mesolimbic pathway, aka the reward pathway, consists of the ventral tegmental area, VTA, plus nucleus accumbens. The prefrontal cortex controls how much and when dopamine is released. Dopamine neuron fires at a low rate until you start thinking about or craving something. It could be as simple as food or coffee, or way more complex. If you get excited or anticipate something, the rate of dopamine firing increases 30 to 40 times and pushes you to take action. Examples of activities and associated dopamine increases are sex, which doubles dopamine levels; nicotine increases dopamine by 150%; cocaine and amphetamine increases dopamine approximately 1000%; and video games can release dopamine somewhere between nicotine and cocaine. Just thinking about the activities of sex, food, and drugs can sometimes release as much dopamine as the actual act of whatever you're craving. Idea number 3, pleasure-pain balance and addiction. When you anticipate something, a little dopamine is released. When you participate in that thing, a little more dopamine is released. When you repeatedly engage in craved behavior, there is a shift away from dopamine and into pain. A subtle feature of the dopamine system: for every bit of dopamine that's released, there's a mirror image downward deflection of pleasure. Part of the experience is to want more of that thing you crave. The more you participate in craving, dopamine reduces and pain increases. This leads to addiction. 15 to 20% of people have a genetic bias towards addiction. Dopamine isn't as much about pleasure as it is the desire and pursuit to reduce the amount of pain. Much of pursuit of pleasure is simply to reduce the pain craving. Part of the enjoyment is craving and wanting more of that. Idea number 4, dopamine versus here and now molecules. The body and brain can direct our attention to inside or outside of us. Dopamine biases us toward thinking about things we don't have. Serotonin, cannabinoids, and other here and now molecules make us content in the present. Dopamine makes us focus on things outside of us that we have to chase. Serotonin makes us think about the here and now. Serotonin is the molecule of bliss and contentment for what you already have. Shift from the dopamine system to the here and now molecule release. Dopamine makes people rabidly in pursuit of things that hit the serotonin system, example, marijuana, tend to make people content. Dopamine can cause high achievers to become manipulative and unpleasant. Dopamine doesn't care how you reach your goals. It only cares that you reach your goals. Idea number 5. Procrastination and motivation. There isn't just one single source of procrastination. Although there are two types of procrastinators. Number 1, people who enjoy the stress of impending deadline, tapping into epinephrine system which activates action in the body. And number 2, people who are simply not releasing enough dopamine. To break procrastination type 1, induce epinephrine release using superoxygenation breathing, caffeine, consume L-tyrosine via red meat or supplement. To break procrastination type 2, induce dopamine release using mucuna pruriens and antidepressants. You can become a person where enough is never enough. The only thing dopamine wants is the release of more dopamine. Idea number 6. Dopamine crash. After dopamine release, prolactin releases. So much dopamine is released in pursuit of a goal, to finish a race, before a big meeting, etc., that it can be hard to manage the crash that comes after. That crash sensation is prolactin. Prolactin is behind things like postpartum depression, letdown, or low after goal, what next feeling. The dopamine prolactin system first evolved for reproduction. After orgasm, prolactin is released and creates the lethargy, stillness period. Vitamin B6 and zinc are potent prolactin inhibitors. There are subjective effects of dopamine. The longer you can extend the arc of positive experience, the more you will offset pain. Idea number 7. Reward prediction error. The possibility of something happening or not happening is deeply woven into the dopamine system. In the neurological system, the surprise, novelty, motivation, and reward release dopamine. Reward prediction error equals to the actual amount of dopamine released in response to something, that is, the amount expected. If you tell a child they might have ice cream later, you are effectively telling the dopamine they will have ice cream. If it doesn't happen, then there's a big dopamine crash. Idea number 8. Attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in kids. The drugs given to treat ADD and ADHD in kids, like Adderall, have amphetamine-like properties. In kids, these drugs activate forebrain circuitry and reduce impulsivity. Impulsivity at age 10 is predictive of overeating disorders later in life. The goal of ADD/ADHD drugs is to suppress the release of dopamine to better control the schedule of dopamine release. Idea number 9. Dopamine schedule. You can control dopamine schedules to optimize motivation and pleasure. There is some subjectivity in dopamine release. Viewing bright light in the middle of the night blunts dopamine and suppresses activation of the reward system. Separate pleasure from motivation. Dopamine is about the motivation of pleasure, not the ability to experience pleasure. Over-the-counter phenethylamine releases dopamine and serotonin at low levels. There is a heightened sense of mental acuity, athletic performance, improved mood, and attention. Caffeine can increase dopamine release in the brain by about 30% and have a protective effect. Idea number 10. To maintain pursuit of goals. To ensure you will remain on the path and exceed previous performance, occasionally remove reward subjectivity. As you move towards the goal, blunt reward response for intermediate goals. Celebrate some wins, but not all wins. Intermittently reduce the impact of reward. Not celebrating keeps the dopamine system in check and avoids the big crash, and keeps you on the path of higher goals. Intermittent reinforcement schedule. Reward yourself every other time, every 10th time, etc. Key takeaways And final summary. Dopamine is involved in wanting, not having. The excitement or anticipation about something increases dopamine firing by 30 to 40 times. Dopamine motivates you to take action towards the things you want. Novelty is the number one trigger of dopamine release. A subtle feature about the dopamine system: for every bit of dopamine that's released, there's a crash associated when prolactin is released. Prolactin is behind the feeling of what's next or let down after a big goal. Dopamine makes us focus on things outside of us that we have to chase. Serotonin makes us content with the here and now. To maintain high levels of motivation, try intermittent reward. Celebrate successes every other time, every 10th time, etc. to blunt dopamine response. Prevent a crash and keep you on the path to bigger goals. This is the end. Thank you.